It is 1274. A huge navy is traversing the Japanese waters. Kublai Khan sent hundreds of ships. Korean, Chinese, and Mongol troops are on board. The invasion of Japan was their common objective. Ahead is their initial target. Tsushima is a small island. So Sukekuni, the local ruler, musters his meager troops on the island. As the army approaches, about 80 samurai and their retainers get ready to fight. They are aware of the odds. They are aware that no reinforcements will arrive. Nevertheless, they decide to fight. The Mongol Empire was a natural power in the late 13th century. It was the biggest land empire in history, founded by Genghis Khan and grown by his descendants. From China to Hungary, kingdoms have been overrun by this juggernaut. The mighty Khan Kublai formed his own Yuan dynasty and ruled over most of China by 1271. However, his dream remained unfulfilled. A nation that had long lived in self-imposed isolation caught his attention as he looked east over the sea: Japan. The outside world was a faraway concern for the Japanese. The military regime, the Kamakura shogunate, which was ruled by the samurai, was actually in charge of Japan, not the emperor in Kyoto. Honor, martial talent, and a strict code of behavior that became known as Bushido served as the foundation for their whole universe. The value of a warrior was determined by their unique deeds of bravery in this civilization of ritualized conflict. They controlled their own islands and had never been really threatened by outside forces. The Mongols were merely a nasty tale from a distant nation, a legend. In 1268, all of that changed. There was a letter from Kublai Khan. It was hardly a cordial welcome. An ultimatum was given: submit and become a vassal state or be invaded. This had been the norm for the Khan. For the samurai of Japan, it was an inconceivable insult. They declined, sending the Mongol envoys home with a message of mute defiance. Kublai Khan was not a man who accepted rejection. His fight in southern China delayed his goals, but he remembered. He considered Japan to be a country of fabled wealth, and its disobedience posed a threat to his authority. He was ready by 1274. A large invading army of Chinese, Korean, and Mongol soldiers was gathered by the Khan. A floating city of war, a fleet of some 900 ships preparing to set sail from the ports of Korea. They transported roughly 8,000 warriors, according to contemporary Japanese accounts. However, contemporary historians think that figure may have been inflated. Tsushima, the tiny island that served as Japan's entryway, was the initial target of this instrument of sheer conquest. Tsushima was a rocky, peaceful outpost that served as a bridge connecting mainland Japan and Korea. The So clan, under the leadership of the elderly deputy governor So Sukekuni, dominated it. He was an experienced fighter who embodied the samurai code of conduct. On November 4, 1274, that peaceful existence came to an end. It was the incredible that lookouts saw. A forest of ship masts had blacked out the horizon, causing it to disappear. The fleet of the Mongol invasion had arrived, but the force must have appeared limitless to the shore-based defenders. Duty was the response to panic. Sukekuni realized that his circumstances were dismal. Approximately 80 mounted samurai and their retainers made up his personal retinue. 80 men against a 1,000-strong army. It made sense to give up. It would have spared the island and saved lives. However, for a samurai, it was not a matter of winning or losing. There was no chance of victory. An honorable death or a life of humiliation was the option. They refused to give up. They would quarrel. Sukekuni made one more attempt at negotiation as the invaders started landing in the middle of night, but a barrage of arrows forced his ambassador back. The Mongols had a clear message: conquest would be the only conversation. The local shrine to the god of war, Hachi, reportedly caught fire as his soldiers were getting ready. According to some stories, white doves gathered there while it burnt, which Sukekuni took to be a sign from God. He assembled his 80 horsemen. They had no intention of protecting the island. For it, they were getting ready to die. They rode to Komoda Beach with their swords drawn and armor buckled, ready for the morning and their legendary charge. The first waves of invaders stormed the beach before sunrise, starting the conflict. It wasn't only a battle that followed, it was a brutal clash of two very different approaches to warfare. Individual bravery was important to the samurai way. A warrior would mount a horse, declare his name and ancestry, and issue a challenge to a duel with an opponent of comparable rank. They were expert longbow shooters, aiming lethal accuracy at precise targets while mounted. In order to begin the battle, Sukekuni and his 80 men did the only thing they knew how to do. They fired a barrage of arrows that struck their targets before brandishing their long tachi swords and charging. But duels and dignity were unimportant to the Mongols. They battled together as a modern, disciplined army. To the rhythm of enormous war drums, they moved forward in close order, forming a wall of shields. Shorter composite bows were employed by their archers, who fired in huge, well-coordinated volleys that obscured the sky and made it hard for the samurai to identify specific targets. They simply mobbed and killed a samurai who charged in seeking a duel. Then came the weapon that made the Japanese genuinely frightened: early explosives made of gunpowder. Tetsuhao, or thunder crash bombs, were hand-thrown explosives used by the Mongols. Primitive shells of gunpowder that burst with a loud roar, releasing shards and smoke. The Japanese horses were startled by the cacophony, which broke their cavalry charges and transformed the battlefield into a samurai's nightmare of fire and noise. The 80 samurai battled with a fierceness that astounded the invaders, despite the shock and the overwhelming odds. They had lethal swordsmanship when they were in close quarters. When wielded by a skilled samurai, the Japanese sword was a frightening weapon that was expertly manufactured. Although this figure is probably fictitious, Japanese histories even stated that one samurai, Tsukasada, personally killed 25 enemy warriors. As a sign of defiance against certain death, Sukekuni led charge after charge. With the bravery of men who had already come to terms with their fate, they fought. But an avalanche could not be stopped by courage. 10 more invaders replaced each one that fell. The throng gobbled up the samurai. The sheer size of the enemy overshadowed their particular skill. The combat on Komoda Beach turned into a vicious, one-sided massacre as the day went on. The weary and diminishing samurai were driven back from the coast. Their charges were broken and they were encircled. But no retreat was considered. Swords in hand, they would die as samurai on foot. Their code was demonstrated in the battle's last stages. Sukekuni assembled his few surviving troops for a final suicide assault into the center of the Mongol army after realizing his force was all but destroyed. Sukekuni was ultimately killed there in a last flash of glory while defending his house. The battle was over by dusk. On the shore, the great bulk of the 80 samurai and their retainers were dead. It was their last stand. It was an expensive but successful victory for the Mongols. They killed civilians and set buildings on fire as they let loose their wrath on the island after the defenders left. Another small garrison of samurai waged an equally valiant but futile fight when the Mongol fleet proceeded from Tsushima to the nearby island of Iki. When Iki fell, its inhabitants also perished. Now aimed straight at the Japanese mainland, the Mongol war machine appeared to be unstoppable. The sacrifice at Tsushima was a military defeat, but there was more to their conflict than that. A small boat conveying an urgent warning to the shogunate's headquarters on the mainland was used by a few survivors to escape during the mayhem. It was a straightforward message: "Here come the Mongols." The rest of Japan had gained valuable time to get ready thanks to the blood of the samurai of the 1980s. Like wildfire, word spread of Tsushima and Iki's defeat and the amazing valor of their small garrisons. Sukekuni and his men's sacrifice was no longer a military setback. It turned into a myth throughout the country. It served as a rallying cry and a representation of a mindset in which honor was more important than life. The nation received a symbol of defiance from the tale of 80 warriors charging a 1,000-strong army. The Mongol armada did not encounter an unprepared nation when they eventually arrived at Hakata Bay on the mainland. There was a more organized samurai army ready. They had heard about it from Tsushima's reports. They were aware of the futility of duels. Instead, they attacked the enormous Mongol ships in the dark by using fortifications and bold nighttime raids in small boats. Despite intense combat, the Mongols were unable to establish a solid base. Then, a strong storm struck when their fleet was anchored in the bay. This typhoon would subsequently be referred to as the Kamikaze, or divine wind, by the Japanese. Thousands of invaders were drowned as hundreds of ships were slammed against the coast and one another. The initial invasion was stopped. In 1281, a furious Kublai Khan launched a second, even more massive invasion. However, the Japanese were ready by then. To stop a landing, they had constructed a huge stone wall along Hakata Bay. A second, far more potent kamikaze struck after weeks of fighting, destroying nearly the whole Mongol fleet. Conquering Japan was a dream that perished in the storm. The Battle of Tsushima, a quick and brutal defeat, is frequently dismissed as a footnote in the broader history of the Mongol invasions. But its true significance isn't determined by the outcome. In the last stand of Sukekuni and his 80 samurai, the human spirit triumphs against insurmountable obstacles. Their sacrifice had a purpose. Japan was able to get ready because of the warning. And the music legend that sparked a nation's retaliation. A pillar of the samurai identity is the tale of the 80 men who charged into nothingness. A reminder that some values are so important that they are worth dying for. They knew they would win the mythology, but they knew they would lose the war.